Okay, so now we're ready to apply the occlusal rim on top of the light cure base. And you're gonna start off with a sheet of base plate wax. And you're gonna heat the wax from one end and slowly roll it over till about 2/3 of the way through, or 3/4 of the way through, okay? So I like to start with the lower, because I have more of a guidance in terms of the ridge, and I know it needs to be centered over the crest of the ridge, at least at the posterior section, and a little more labially when we get to the interior portion of the ridge. So as you can see, I soften the wax. And you want to make sure that you fold it so you don't trap any air in between layers. I tend to melt the inside of the wax a little bit and soften the outside, so when I do roll it over, it creates a nice bonding. Eliminates any possible air pockets. Make sure you use ample heat to soften the wax, because you're gonna have to manipulate this wax a little bit, and if you don't add enough heat to it, it's gonna get cold and you won't be able to do it. So I'm about halfway through, almost halfway through, and as I'm starting to fold, it becomes more of a roll than a fold. Gonna keep going. So I'm about 2/3 of the way through, or somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4, and I'll cut off the excess. I have more than what I need right here in terms of establishing the correct height and width of the occlusal rim. So I'll just cut this off, and you can simply put this back in your wax cup if you have enough room, or set it aside. So right about here, obviously I'm going to use the middle portion of this roll to go over the midpoint of the ridge. So I'm going to pinch it a little bit thinner here to get closer to 4 to 6 millimeters. And then I'm going to give it a little bit of a shape. And somewhat place it over the crest of the ridge. Now if I turn it to its side, you can see how the back portion interferes quite a bit. So I can take my blade and cut this at an angle on both sides. So I'm just going to heat up my blade a little bit here and cut that off, and cut that off. And that will allow me to sit the wax a little bit closer . So once again, the posterior portion of the wax rim that you just rolled together, make sure that it sits over the crest of the ridge, while the interior is a little further interiorly. So the lingual portion is going to sit over the crest of the ridge. You don't have to get it exact right now, just get it somewhat close. And before I move it further and get it to more of an ideal position, I'm going to flow some wax in between the two halves just to seal things a little bit so it doesn't move around too much. So just make sure that this wax is fairly hot so it creates a nice seal between the base and the rim itself. And now that I have some initial seal between the two, I can further stretch this out to create the right position, and also start thinking about the buccal slope that we talked about earlier, and maybe a little bit of a labial inclination here, or pretty much straight up and down, something like that. So I have to fill all that void in there with some more wax now. And for the next step, I'm going to turn to my font stock, which is a lot bigger than my number 7 spatula, so I can pick up some wax and really move things along. I'm just going to cut it off here just before the retromolar pad. Somewhat at an angle. Make sure that you don't have any debris from your wax cup, more carbon or pencil marks or anything like that. Just remember, this is going to go in somebody's mouth, so we'll have to keep it clean. So I'm going to flow a little bit of wax here just to get things started. And then by having the right consistency in your wax cup, you can pick up some wax that's somewhat semi-melted, like so, and apply. And that makes things move along rather quickly. Bit of a little debris from my wax cup. I'm going to get rid of that. And I'm just going to make my way across. Heat up your font stock and just go back and blend it in. You can certainly do this at the end, but when you finish up every little section at a time, I think it kind of guides you a little bit better for the next one. The height of the occlusal rim right now is much taller than I need, but that's okay. We're going to cut that down to size, and we're going to finalize it with our rim former. So by having the right consistency in your wax cup at this point really helps a lot. Otherwise, you're gonna take a long time trying to finalize by filling in all that void. A little more here, and I can move on the lingual side. You don't always have to add wax. I have enough wax here that I can just simply heat up my tool and kind of manipulate the wax in a way that I can displace it from one side to the other. So you can see it there, it's starting to take shape. I'm going to add some more here. Clean up this little bit here. And if you have any bubbles or air pockets in there, make sure that you either heat them out or poke them out. Should look like one solid piece. And if you fold it properly, you shouldn't see any of the folds when you created your occlusal rim. So now I'll move on the inside. This one's a little easier because the shape of the lingual extension kind of holds my wax a little bit. You can use your air nozzle to chill the wax a little bit before you move to the next section, but don't use it aggressively because the wax is still soft and you might splatter it. So just a gentle stream of air just to cool it before you move to the next section. And if you position your occlusal rim correctly, this creates a nice buccal slope angle almost by default, providing the extensions with the final impression were correct. It's getting a little tight in here, so I'm going to go back to my number 7 spatula. And blend things together. And you can almost see this buccal slope angle on the sides, or the buccal aspect of the occlusal rim. This one looks like it's a little bit too far in, but because I've added so much warm wax all around it, I can still manipulate this rim, either move it in or move it out if I wish to make it symmetrical and to move it to the right position. So take the time now to position it correctly. I'm going to heat my spatula and flow some wax back here. I'm not adding any new wax, I'm just taking some of the existing wax, melting it, and allowing it to flow. And same thing on the other side. Eventually the height of this occlusal rim will end up being 2/3 up the retromolar pad. Sorry, let me correct that. Halfway up the retromolar pad. So the height of the posterior section of the rim is going to be halfway up the retromolar pad. And once this cools down and I'm able to remove it and clean it up a little bit, I'm going to make some indications where that is, halfway up the retromolar pad. And I think in retrospect, we could have indicated the crest of the ridge on this land area of the section back here. So if you have trouble seeing the crest of the ridge, you can certainly draw it on the model, extend it over to the land area before you actually fabricate your occlusal rim to guide you. Okay. There's also a slight little curvature, what we call a buccal curvature in here. So it's not exactly straight, but there's a slight little curvature at the posterior section of the rim. So you want to do that with both sides, and again, mirror both sides to keep everything looking symmetrical. Before I move to the upper, because I'm going to allow this to cool down a little bit, I'm going to use my alcohol torch and just kind of go over things and smooth things out a little bit. And again, we're going to have a little bit of wax overlap the land area, but that's not a big deal. We're going to go back and clean that up after. My alcohol torch is fairly close to the wax, and I'm not using a lot of heat to melt things. I'm just using a gentle amount of heat just to soften things up a little bit. And as you'll see later on, I'm going to carve it further, heat it some more, and get it really, really smooth. I can see a hint of a bubble here, so what I'm going to do, just heat up my instrument and go in there and just poke it a little bit, and that'll allow the air to escape and wax to fill in that void. So once again, the occlusal rim is way higher than what I anticipate. And that's quite okay. That's an easy fix. So I'm going to move to the lingual side. And do the same thing. There's a little bit back here that I need to go back and correct. So I want to get it as smooth as possible before I let this cool off. Just a final look. Since I have ample heat on the wax right now, I still have another opportunity to move it around and make it symmetrical. Make sure it's in the right position before it cools off. If you miss something and the wax totally cools down and you realize this after the fact that you need to move, let's say, one quadrant in or the other one out, you can soak this or put this in lukewarm water to soften the wax and move it around again. Okay? So that looks, I think, pretty close right now. So I'm going to set this one aside and bring the upper one in. Unlike the lower one, the upper one I did have indications of the midline and the crest of the ridge here. So I can use those as a guide where to place my occlusal rim. So we're going to use the same technique. We're going to use a piece of base plate wax, fresh sheet. And we're going to start folding, and eventually this will turn into a roll. Just once again, make sure that you fold it nicely so you don't get any air trapped in between each layer. And this one I'm going to move just a little bit faster since the technique is exactly the same. But be sure to introduce sufficient heat to the wax so you have a little more working time to manipulate the wax. So I'm about 2/3 or 3/4 of the way through. That's a lot of thickness there that I've created, so that's pretty good. I'm going to cut off the excess. And once more, I'm going to thin out this middle section here, which will sit over the midline, and that'll be the thinnest portion. And maybe stretch it out a little bit. So I'm pulling it out a little bit because I know this is not enough to cover the whole arch. So I'm thinning it out, I'm stretching it out. So in essence, I'm making this piece longer than when I started. Keep in mind the shape of the ridge, and you want to keep the rim relatively the same shape, whether it be square, square tapered, or ovoid. And now I'm positioning the lingual side of the rim over the crest of the ridge. You might not be exact right now, but I think I'm pretty close, that I can seal it down like I did on the lower and maybe move it around some more. Before I do that though, I'm going to cut off this posterior section about halfway through the retromolar pad at a slight angle. How much of an angle? Oh, about 30 degrees or so. And just like the way we finished the lower, we're going to seal this initially. And the maxillary occlusal rim is going to have more of a labial inclination, meaning the front portion of the occlusal rim will appear that it's tilted outwards away from the palate towards the labial. And if we look at it from the side right now, in relation to the base, it really doesn't. So I need to bring this portion of the rim that way. So I'll place it back down now that I've sealed it, and I'll make sure I'm holding my base plate down, and I can stretch this out quite easily. With the posterior section having the lingual side of the rim over the crest of the ridge with a slight little buckle curvature. And by the time I fill in this space, I'm going to have just the right amount of buckle slope. So now I'm going to go to my font stock. I'm going to start on the lingual on this one. It really doesn't make a difference whether you start on the lingual or the facial, as long as you have a nice blending. So by the end of it all, everything will appear as one piece. If you find your font stock might be a little bit too big to fit in here, then you can always go back to your number 7 spatula. It's not a very difficult skill to master in terms of bite block fabrication, but nevertheless, it's very important because how you position things will have an effect how the patient behaves, where their muscles rest, where their lips rest, in order to achieve proper measurements. So now I'll move to the facial aspect, buccal and labial. In the previous video, I did remove the base from the model just to prove a point in terms of getting an overall sense of the shape of the ridge and how big it's going to be and where the bite block, or sorry, the occlusal rim will be placed. But in reality, you don't need to remove that section. You can just do it right after you cleaned it up a little bit over the land area. But because I did, I'm being very mindful right now to make sure that this base plate does not lift off the model as I'm adding layers of wax on top of it. And I'm going to use my instrument to make sure that I don't trap any air bubbles within each layer that I'm adding. And you got to be careful of the flow of the wax as well. I think as you can see there that I'm starting to think about the buccal slope angle, which is somewhere between 5 and 10 degrees. Unlike the other side, I still need to fill all that in. So proper extensions with your final impressions and a proper position of the occlusal rim over the master cast and over the base, I think will create that buccal slope angle for you almost by default most of the time. And take the time to make sure that you don't have any air trapped inside the wax. There's a lot of molted wax there, so I'm just going to use my air nozzle just to chill that down a little bit. Just clean off a little piece of debris. And finish off this last little section here. And I think it would make sense to have a full cup of wax before you start this procedure, because if you don't, you're probably going to run out of wax with the right consistency to do this. Clean this off back here. And I always like to have the back portion of the rim a little rounded. So I'm just going to cut off the corners here and here, and go back with my fawn stock and smooth things out. So take the time to smooth things out with your fawn stock, or maybe carve them with a knife, which I haven't done so yet. I didn't feel the need that I had to, but I probably will. And what you don't see on camera is the fact that I'm heating, obviously, my fawn stock or my number 7 spatula over the Bunsen burner as I feel the instrument getting cool and it's not doing what I want it to do, to melt some wax. I know there's still ample heat on the wax, so I'm just going to give it an overall assessment now in terms of the labial inclination, which is approximately 15 degrees or so. So if I look at it from a side view, this should have somewhat of a labial inclination in relation to the base of the cast, providing the base of the cast was trimmed parallel to the residual ridge. So it doesn't. So while the occlusal rim is still warm, I'm going to hold my base plate down and push it out some more. I can still do that. So now I've created a little more labial inclination here, but I need to go back and maybe feather things in a little bit. And keeping in mind the shape of the ridge, which I think for this particular model is a squared tapered shape. So I gave it more of a tapered, squared, tapered look here. Tapered here, and it becomes square in the back. So just the final melting of the wax to smooth things out before I apply any alcohol on it, just like I did on the lower, my alcohol torch on it. Otherwise, if you have too many irregular surfaces on your wax and you start using your alcohol torch, you're probably going to melt a lot of wax all over the place and it becomes very messy. Having said that, I think I've kept things relatively clean here. And a little bit on the inside as well. I'm going to finish off with a number 7 spatula in here because it's becoming a little narrow for me to go in there with a font stock. So I'll use something smaller. And finally, I'm going to smooth things out with the alcohol torch. Little bubble there. If I continue applying heat with the alcohol torch, I think I'm just going to lose control of the wax, so I'm just going to go in there and poke it ever so slightly with a heated instrument. Let that cool off, or if you have an air nozzle, blow that off a little bit and finish off on the inside. And the inside, you want it to have a nice smooth palate as well, because that's what the patient is going to feel with her tongue. If you recall, the base plate was rather rough, but we introduced a very fine layer on top of it, so we can give the patient the sensation of having a nice smooth finish, just like a finished denture. So I'm going to set this one aside, and I'm going to start carving my lower occlusal rim to shape.